It was Jenna's first day on the night shift at Crest Care Home, an old and somewhat rundown facility at the edge of town. The place had a reputation not for its care, which was decent enough, but for the eerie stories whispered by the longtime staff. Jenna had always brushed off such talk. Ghost stories and creepy tales were just part of the job in places like this, where the walls seemed to breathe history and the nights stretched on forever. Her shift started at 10 p.m., and by the time she arrived, the building was already steeped in shadows. The day staff gave her a brief, almost hurried rundown before disappearing into the night. That left Jenna alone with the night supervisor, Mrs. Taylor, a woman who seemed as old as the building itself, with deep-set eyes and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. "You'll be fine, dear," Mrs. Taylor assured her. "Just make sure you check on each of the residents every hour. They tend to get restless at night." With that, Mrs. Taylor disappeared into her office, leaving Jenna to start her rounds. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. Jenna walked the dimly lit halls, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The residents were mostly asleep, save for a few who muttered in their dreams or shifted restlessly in their beds. It wasn't until she reached the East Wing, the oldest part of the building, that she began to feel uneasy. The East Wing had always been the subject of the most unsettling stories, the ones about strange noises, cold drafts, and shadows that moved just out of sight. Tonight, the air was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. As Jenna passed room 209, she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat. The door to 209 was slightly ajar, and from inside, she could hear the whispering grow louder. It was an old man's voice, trembling and weak. Steeling herself, Jenna pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for the bed, which was neatly made. The old man who had occupied it had passed away a week earlier, and no new resident had taken his place. But the whispering continued, filling the room like a cold breeze. "Who's there?" Jenna called out, her voice trembling slightly. But there was no answer, only the relentless whispering that seemed to seep from the very walls. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The door flew open, and Jenna stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The lights flickered again, and this time, she was certain she saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor, watching her with hollow eyes. Jenna backed out of the room, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The whispering followed her into the hallway, growing fainter as she moved further away from 209. She hurried to the nurse's station, hoping to find Mrs. Taylor, but the office was empty. The older woman was nowhere to be found. Alone in the darkened hallway, Jenna felt the first pricklings of fear. She forced herself to continue her rounds, telling herself that it was just her imagination, that old buildings made noises, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. The shadows seemed to lengthen and shift as she walked by, and once or twice, she thought she saw a figure at the end of the corridor, just out of the corner of her eye. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. At midnight, the lights flickered. Jenna paused, holding her breath. The lights dimmed, then brightened again, but the momentary darkness had been enough to unnerve her. She quickened her pace, eager to finish her rounds and get back to the relative safety of the nurse's station. It was just past 2 a.m. when Jenna heard the noise again this time. It was a soft shuffling, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. The sound came from the East Wing again, near room 209. Jenna froze, her pulse quickening. She wanted to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, but something compelled her to go back, to see for herself what was making the noise. As she approached 209, she saw it. The door, which she was certain she had closed earlier, was now wide open. The shuffling sound was louder now, as if someone or something was moving around inside. Jenna took a deep breath and stepped into the room. It was empty, the bed was still made, the room undisturbed. But the air was heavy with the scent of something old and decaying, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Jenna spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The room grew colder, the air thickening until it was hard to breathe. The whispering returned, louder now, more insistent, surrounding her from all sides. Panicking, Jenna reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, calling out for help, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The shadows crept closer, the whispering rising to a deafening crescendo. Jenna ran. She didn't care where she was going, she just needed to get away from the East Wing, away from room 209. She raced through the halls, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty building. When she finally reached the nurse's station, Mrs. Taylor was there, her expression calm and troubled. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice as calm as ever. Jenna tried to explain what had happened, but the words caught in her throat. Mrs. Taylor simply nodded, as if she understood. "The night shift can be difficult," she said quietly. "This place, it has its own way of making you feel things, see things. But don't worry, you get used to it." Jenna didn't know what to say. She spent the rest of her shift huddled behind the desk, her eyes darting to the clock every few minutes, counting down the hours until dawn. The whispers had stopped, and the shadows remained still, but the feeling of being watched lingered, never letting her fully relax. When her shift finally ended, Jenna practically ran out of the building, the cold morning air a welcome relief. She didn't look back, didn't stop until she was safely in her car, the engine running, ready to take her far away from Crest Field Care Home. As she drove away, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, that the shadows from the East Wing were stretching out, trying to pull her back. She promised herself she wouldn't return, that she would find another job, anything to avoid another night at that place. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she swore she saw something, a figure standing in the middle of the road, watching her drive away, its hollow eyes filled with the darkness of the night.